God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. He follows Jesus into an unknown future. Simon bar Jonah, Simon, son of John. Today we would call him Simon Johnston. He is a fisherman from Capernaum, a pretty Roman village on the Sea of Galilee. It resembles a California landscape, a beautiful blue sea with sunburnt grasses and little stone-built houses dotting the landscape. And we know very little about his early personal life, but he is called by Jesus to become a fisher of men. And what I love about the story of Peter, there's this dynamic quality in the Gospels about the development of the personality and the character of Peter, both as a human being and as a model disciple of Jesus. He emerges as one of the people closest to Jesus from the earliest of days. He gets to know and experience this man in a unique way. He gets to see him teaching and healing, being criticized by the religious authorities of his day. He gets to see him feed thousands of people. He gets to see him still a violent storm. And here Peter is this experienced fisherman, and he is terrified for his own life. He gets to see the physical appearance of Jesus, his face and his garments transformed on the mountaintop of transfiguration, and accompanied by a vision of Moses and Elijah. And he gets to hear the voice of God, "This is my beloved, hear him." And so it is significant that the universal church remembers Peter on this day. And it's right in the middle of the Epiphany season. And Epiphany, we're asking ourselves in the lectionary during the Epiphany season, who is this guy Jesus? Tell us more about him. What is he about? And so in the middle of that Epiphany season, you get this statement by Peter, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Epiphany is a kind of like a light bulb experience. And so the church is exploring this collectively as we look at who Jesus is. So in today's gospel reading, years have passed from the baptism in the Jordan. Jesus is on retreat with Simon Peter and the other disciples. And Jesus has just run into another encounter, a bad encounter, with the religious leadership of his day. And he's warning the disciples to be careful not to be fooled by the teaching of the scribes and the Pharisees. And then he asks them about his opinion polls. Who do people think I am? And they think John the Baptist, one of the prophets. And then Jesus says, well, what about you? Who do you think I am? And then Peter just blurts out this kind of alpha male, hand up first in class. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And it's very interesting that Peter kind of gets the right answer, but he hasn't really thought much about the implications of what it means to be God's anointed one. And right after this passage, Matthew then talks about Jesus sets his face towards Jerusalem and the cross. And that's a very significant kind of turn in the gospel. And he talks about how the Messiah must suffer and die and be raised again. And Peter has a really hard time with that. I mean, it's interesting, a couple of verses past this great kind of recognition of Peter's insight that Jesus and Peter are at it in conflict. And it's so bad that at one point Jesus says, "Get thee behind me, Satan," because you are not accepting that the Messiah, this Messiah thing is about suffering and the transformation of broken humanity into something else. Peter, he gets the right answer, but he's not ready to look at the implications and to accept that this is all about it. And it's the Messiah was going to be this warrior, powerful leader. Suffering was not a part of this. And so this theme of conflict between Jesus and Peter is right through the Gospels. It doesn't go away. There's this pushback. And Jesus predicts, Peter is very loyal to Jesus. Jesus predicts that Peter will betray him, that when push comes to shove, that Peter just will not be there for Jesus. And there's this kind of remorse, there's this scene where, as Jesus is arrested, Peter runs away. He runs away. I didn't sign up for this. I tried to protect you, Jesus. Peter's the guy who cuts off the sword of the servant, one of the high priest's servant, cuts off his ear. He's prepared to use violence to protect Jesus. And Jesus says, put away your sword. He still doesn't get it. And then he runs away. There's another story that's associated with Peter that's mentioned in 3 of the Gospels. And I think it's a very significant story. And it happens underneath Peter's own roof in Capernaum. And I've been there's a little house, they claim it's Peter's house in Capernaum. So this was a moment, his mother-in-law was ill. And Jesus hears that the mother-in-law is sick, and this pastoral concern that Jesus has, he wants to go and to be there, be with the family. And he holds her hand and he raises her up. And the words is that he commands the fever to leave her. And she gets up and she's so, renewed that she makes them dinner. And Peter must have really thought about that. This guy, who is this Jesus? Who is this person who has done this to my own family? And I'm sure that story never left him. And then there is one other story that is mentioned in John's Gospel, which is a significant story. And it's about the development and the maturity of this person who is very frail and doesn't get it right the first time and is very opinionated, but yet Jesus sees in him something that he's going to live into. Very powerful. And this story is after the resurrection. And it's a story where Peter is back with his buddies in Galilee fishing early one morning, and they see this figure on the beach, and it's obviously a resurrection experience. And they come into the shore with their fish, and Jesus cooks them breakfast with the fish. And it's like the Eucharist. And there's this very deep conversation where Jesus is saying to this more mature Peter, he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Pointing to the other disciples. And Peter says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my lambs. And again Jesus says, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, care for my sheep. And the third time he says to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hand, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. John's Gospel. And it's interesting that, again, you have a moment of a kind of spiral moment. It's a spiral moment. Peter is back where he started, but he's different. He's changed. And this relationship with this man who calls him by the Sea of Galilee is deepening. And Jesus is predicting Peter's own martyrdom. He's going to be crucified. Legend is upside down in Rome. Right? Feed my sheep. Follow me. Feed my lambs. We know that Peter emerges as the kind of head, the chief apostle in the Jerusalem church. He works with Jesus' brother James. And one of the first things they do in this new emerging community is they look out for the people who are most marginalized in their community. And this idea of feeding the flock, it wasn't just people who are our own kind. It was looking at the people who are in the margins, the ministry to the widows and orphans of Jerusalem. And we get this sense that right from the beginning, the healing ministry of Jesus that continues through the apostles is also about the repairing of the world. Both go together, the feeding and the protection of the flock, of the sheep. And not just the people who are inside, but also the people who are outside. And what's very interesting, again, about this dynamic quality, Peter is a very devout Jew, and he believes strongly that you can't be a Christian if you're not a Jew, right? Very religious, cultural, cut and dried. And he has this dream, and it's the dream of this cornucopia of food that's dropped out of a great blanket from the sky. And it's about the Jewish kosher laws. And God says to him, it's all clean, go and eat. And they're witnessing that people who are non-Jews, Gentiles, have the same gifts of the Spirit. And so Peter has another conversion. And he's being pushed by this guy, Paul, who's a kind of converted fundamentalist Jew, who's bringing all these Gentiles into the church. And so even in his leadership, there is this kind of transformation that's going on with Peter. He's always breaking through his own limitations. Extraordinary. And in Peter, we have a model of servant leadership. We have a model of how the work of Jesus is going to continue, the healing work of Jesus. And it's interesting in the reading from the Acts of the Apostles, where he's healing somebody, and because he's breaking Jewish Sabbath laws, he has to think on his feet. He has to stand, and he becomes a teacher. And, you'd think that healing somebody from some horrible disease and illness would be good in itself, but no, the religious and secular authorities, they want, why are you doing this? Why are you breaking religious law? And so he has to become an apologist. And he becomes this extraordinary gifted teacher. So the feeding of the flock and the protection of the flock is not only about healing, but it's about feeding the soul, feeding the mind, trying to convince people intellectually that this is the right thing to do. And even in his skepticism, in his limitations, in his betrayal, and his remorse, there is something that is constantly transformed in the character of Peter, that he emerges as this extraordinary leader. And he is martyred in Rome, and the Christian community, the place where his remains are buried, the Christian community worshiped there for 2,000 years, venerating, and St. Peter's Basilica is built on his grave. And he is recognized as the apostle, the first pope, and the authority, the whole idea of the giving of the keys of the kingdom, to bind and to loose, to protect and to open, comes from this conversation that we celebrate today. So every Sunday every St. Peter's Day, I kind of reflect on the kind of state of the parish. And I want to take that story and I want to transfer that as a kind of template for us in St. Peter's. We look to Peter. When we talk about, I go to St. Peter's, we are invoking this figure from history and from the experience and this template of what it means to be a disciple, to follow Jesus, to love Jesus, to feed the flock, to take care of the lambs. Do we love Jesus, and how do we love Jesus in the modern world today? And one of the reading from Peter, it's interesting you were talking about being the elders of the church. That's not just about being a senior, it's about being a leader. The elders were like the vestry. So the vestry is one of the ways in the Episcopal tradition that we take on leadership, servant leadership, to guard the mission, and a way in which we are also struggling with how do we provide the resources for the marginalized, the widows and orphans of our day. That's something the vestry struggles with. How do we feed and care for the flock? How do we do pastoral care in the congregation? And how do we feed the mind and the soul? And so the vestry is elected by you to take responsibility for that and to somehow make it work. And it's challenging. The vestry works very, very hard. A lot of it's behind the scenes. And the letter to Peter is addressed to people in leadership like the vestry, about being servant leaders and how to continue to heal and transform God's world. In December, I was thinking about this in terms of our own life here. We had 11 members of our congregation who needed significant pastoral care and attention. We had one significant death, Jessica. There was a lot of work that everybody, kicked in around that. Enormous pastoral care was provided by you to that family. Extraordinary. So we are doing that. We are providing pastoral care to one another. We had a member who had open heart surgery, was in Mount Sinai for a month. We had people who are living and dealing with cancer and dealing with dementia, and all the family kind of knock off from that. So I'm seeing, been here 4.5 years now, I'm seeing the effect of an aging congregation, and I know that the pastoral care needs of St. Peter's is only going to get more complicated. And this is a reality. So if we translate that, feeding the flock, taking care of the flock, what does that mean in terms of pastoral care? We had a new member who appeared this past year who was a trained Stephen minister, and we thought that one of the ways that we could start to accommodate that was to have a Stephen ministry training. It's a lay program that is recognized by many churches in the country. And the unfortunate thing is that everybody who signed up for it didn't show up. And so that idea of developing a Stephen ministry, it just didn't work. At the same time, my time went from 4 days a week last year, when Nastia was hired, to 3 days a week. So clearly, as we work on a model of a part-time priest, there needs to be some kind of stepping up by the lay community to take on pastoral care. It's simple. And the vestry is kind of discerning that. What is that going to look like? And we've been very lucky in the last 6 months. We've had Nastia as a great asset to the parish. And I'm thinking of one of the great gifts that Nastia brings is this deepening of the journey of faith. There's a great depth and spirituality to Nastia. And I think this congregation is ready. There are many of you that Sunday worship is wonderful, but it isn't enough. You want places where you can talk about your faith and your struggles, and ways in which, how as a community can we feed the soul and feed the mind, right? And we're doing that. The women's retreat is a great idea that Nastia is doing. The Advent series was a great way that people in the congregation talked about what love means to them in the modern world today. It was an extraordinary witness to the work that's going on quietly. And we're going to do another series in Lent. And we're starting a men's group on a Saturday morning. And this is about the feeding of the soul that you're asking for, that you are hungry for. And it's a sign, as we look to Peter, it's a sign of our maturing in our discipleship. It's absolutely going in the right direction. So these pieces, part of Peter's work was to integrate all the pieces, the complexity that he found himself in his character, warts and all. And we're kind of doing that here at St. Peter's. And the way that we do that is through making sure that our leadership, the vestry, is in charge of the mission, the budget, and is trying to look to the future as we prepare for the road ahead. And that we are here, the resources that we have, is largely because of leadership in the past who thought about the future. And some of the areas that we will be struggling with this year is when Nastia leaves in August. What do we need as a congregation? And the vestry is talking about maybe we need a second priest who will help with pastoral care and Christian ed. and develop this kind of deepening ministry that we have around, that we're beginning to see and we're beginning to enjoy. So it is important that leadership is discerned and appointed and elected by you, the congregation, so that that vestry is in tune with where we're going. It is vital that that is happening. Ann Gillis and I, we meet on Easter Monday and we tally the votes. So we know there were something like 61 people who took part in the elections for last year. And what we were concerned about was that a significant percentage of those 60 people we hardly see at St. Peter's. They're pledging, but they're peripheral. And so what's that about is there's a disconnect between people who are coming to church and taking on the responsibility of electing leaders to the vestry. And so we need to think differently as we go into a new election at Easter, that we discern who are the right people, that we as a congregation, I don't appoint the vestry, you do, but I have to work with the vestry. The vestry is responsible for the budget. The vestry is responsible for the resources. The vestry is responsible for hiring and firing the vicar. And that's how we balance power and authority in the Episcopal Church. And if the vestry is out of whack, or if the vicar is out of whack, we're in trouble. And so this is a really good Sunday for us to reflect on the model of Peter as he grows into something that maybe he himself didn't imagine, and how that applies to this parish, and how we take on that commission to feed the flock, to feed the mind. Who are the widows and orphans in our world today that we are called to engage with and to transform? At the end of the first service this morning, there was a gentleman who came, and he was living in his car, homeless, a veteran. He told me that he fought in a number of important recent wars. And because of the government shutdown, he had to leave his home. He had no money. And so last night he slept in his car, kept the engine running. And so we were able to connect him and give him a little resources from this congregation. We are doing the work of the people of God. We'll hear in the announcements a little bit about what's happening in Dover Plains. There's 40 immigrants who have been kind of abandoned in Dover Plains, who are wearing ankle bracelets provided by a private company that is making a lot of money on tracking immigrants while they prepare for their paperwork in this country. So they have to go down by train to New York City to be processed. They're not allowed to work. And so our outreach committee this week made a decision that we're giving $1,000 to help with train fare, to help these people get into New York City. And Nasty is working with St. Thomas's Armenia and Grace Church and some other people in the community. But here we are looking right into the widows and orphans of our day, and that we are called to feed the flock. So I'm inspired by the model that the Gospels present of Peter, because he doesn't get it right the first time. It takes a while for him to mature and live into this vision that God is calling us all into. This awesome vision that the church is this community that Peter led, and that we too are stewards of. And that we fashion our lives in this community in the image of the Apostle Peter as we grow into something that may surprise even us, warts and all. Right answers, but the wrong assumptions. Conflict and pushback, that we may become recognized as a Christ-like community of love and servant leadership that is both welcoming, a place of intellectual and spiritual feeding, as well as the hospital for the soul. Whatever age, wherever we find ourselves on our journey of faith. Amen.